Good evening, everyone. So this is a joint subcommittee meeting for both the policy subcommittee as well as for the DEIJ subcommittee. Our agenda is mainly going to be focused on review of the proposed Public Schools of Brookline equity policy, including the student section. But first, Val is going to begin with approval of the minutes. Valerie?
Yeah. So if everybody on DEIJ has had a chance, we're going to move the August minutes. Someone willing to move the August minutes?
I'll move them.
Thank you, Stephen. Is there a second?
Second.
Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. Mariah is still away. David, did you want to move your policy minutes?
Yes. So would someone like to move the minutes from the policy review subcommittee meeting of November 14th?
I'll move them.
Thank you, Jennifer. Is there a second?
I'll second them.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie, your vote?
Yes.
Jennifer, your vote?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. And that brings us to discussion of proposed Public Schools of Brookline equity policy.
Thank you,
Jennifer,
David.
I'm sorry. Yes, I do have a question. Before we start, could we maybe introduce ourselves? There's some folks that I'm not familiar with, so that would be helpful for me. And I'll start if it's okay with the chair. This is both chairs. I don't know. I'm Jennifer Monopoly. I am a member of the full school committee. I'm also a member of the policy subcommittee.
I'll go next. I'm Andy Liu, vice chair of the school committee. I'm on DEIJ, but not policy.
I'm David Perlman. I'm chair of the school committee, chair of the policy subcommittee. Stephen, why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Ehrenberg. I'm on both the DEIJ and policy subcommittees.
Valerie?
I'm Val Frias. I'm the chair of the DEIJ subcommittee, and I'm also on the policy subcommittee.
Janae?
Hi, everyone. Janae Utaro, Senior Director of Equity. I am on the DEIJ subcommittee and Government Relations subcommittee.
See that Suzanne just logged in. Suzanne would like to introduce yourself for the group.
Sure. Hi, there I am. Hi, I'm Suzanne Fettersfield. I am on the school committee.
All right, we have someone else logged in as Janae, but it's not Janae. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Am I logged into Janae? Hi,
Yes.
I'm Hey Young Ko. I don't know why it's logged into Janae. I'm the new assistant director of educational equity, working with Janae. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Syra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Sarah, and I'm a junior at Brookline High School.
Lakia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Lakia. I'm a parent of students at the Driscoll and the Brookline High Schools.
Thank you.
And as one of our so thank you. So what we have before us is our bare bones policy that we put together, as folks probably remember, after our statement on the incidents at the high school. And this is the policy that has emerged from that. We spent a couple of meetings, both separately and jointly with policy, working on the staff section, which is thank you, Andy, and then everyone for their edits is in really good shape. We now are turning to the student section, which, as you all can see from our first draft, is in bare bones form. I was hoping that our students, because they've been working on this in their own realms for many, many months, would be able to assist in the drafting of this, and hopefully they will. Janae, have they allowed you to share the content from some of their documents today?
I do have the Tackling Injustice, the longer version that actually Laura Cleaves was one of the primary authors of. So I do have that available to share, as well as the Dean's social emergency plan, which the students also weighed in on. So I do have those.
So if folks are amenable, I would like to use those just for idea brainstorming. I looked at them, I think in probably earlier iterations with Janae, and they were both pretty strong documents. They need a little bit of work to turn them into what we would call district policy documents, or pieces of them into district policy documents. But I think that they cover lots of the areas that we want to cover. So given that Janae and I did not get a chance to draft an updated student section, I thought this would actually be a good place to start, review, and prioritize ideas that we want in the student section.
Val, do you want me to?
Can you share screen? That'd
Yeah,
be
can
great.
I share screen? Oh, I can share screen. Okay. Before I share screen, let me just say, this particular doc, this first one, am I sharing screen already? Can everybody see this? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I can tell. So this is called the Tackling Injustice, the Ultimate Hate Crime Administrative Policy Bill, which Laura, Addie, and Matt shared at a school committee meeting. I'm not sure what the date was. And as Val mentioned, it's it's quite long. I apologize that I didn't share the doc earlier with folks. It's gone through several versions, and a couple of things to know about it as I scroll down to some of the bare bones in it. This policy right now really got a lot of heavy attention last spring in legislature. There was a BU law professor that helped the students kind of come up with this, and they worked with a number of people. The group is actually hopeful to collaborate with the DEIJ subcommittee or school committee to they love the idea of a second set of eyes on it because it's stalled a little bit. And they want to keep going. I can keep scrolling down, but essentially, as you can tell, sort of the context has to do with this idea of partnering with the intentions of obviously the adult educators in the community at large, that a strong message is sent in the public schools of Brookline, that prejudice and intolerance are never tolerated at BHS. This is specific to BHS, obviously, and they want to have some changes made to the handbook. So there's version 1 of the bill here, which I know is probably a little bit small. I can try and make this a little bit bigger. Sorry, I'll do that. And then this goes to version 2, but here's what they're saying about what administrators will be required to do. I'll scroll down and then go back up so people can actually read, but just to give you a sense, here's version 2. It's a little bit bigger. A couple of additions were made with sort of the steps, sort of the progressive steps that they identified. And just so people can see as I scroll down, sorry for the whiplash, there's also a version 3 that goes along with the tiering that they sort of identified. And this is the piece that they presented to school committee in the spring. And then version 3 has a little bit more around some pieces after meeting with the BHS deans. So I can go, and there's the social emergency plan that I mentioned, which I can also share with people. This is the work that the BHS deans did. So I'm going to scroll back up, if that's okay, and give people a couple of minutes just to read through a little bit of what's in that version 1. And sorry, I don't know how familiar you are with this bill. I think Kevin knew a little bit about it.
So the different versions are they're mutually exclusive, like one or the other, or only one of the 3 can ever go into effect, or are they like different parts of the same?
They're additions or revisions to original versions. The students just in this particular draft didn't copy all the stuff that remained. They just added the additive pieces, if that makes sense.
Okay, so everything in the current document is sort of current, like
current as of last spring. Quite honestly, I spoke with Jen Martin, who's the sort of the advisor for the legislature this morning, and she mentioned that the heavy work on this happened last spring, and it's been slow to get going this year. That set, so I don't know that they've met again on this fall, but they were excited about a second set of eyes on it.
And what process remains to get it passed at BHS?
It's a great question, Andy. I'm not completely sure. I feel like the idea was the school year ended, and the idea was to come back as a full sort of legislature and look at it again and brainstorm some ideas around whatever else they wanted to do to really get it to the next stage, to send it to the headmaster, take the votes, all that kind of thing. And my understanding is that they haven't had time to do that yet. So this actually serves as a really great push for them, that we're spending some time looking at their language. Okay. That's what Jen Martin expressed to me.
Janae, is it possible to share this document with the folks on the call when you have a chance? Probably not when you're presenting it, but maybe afterwards.
Sure. You make a good point. Maybe I shouldn't try to share it now, unless you all want me to share it right now. Now that I'm doing it, why don't I just do it?
Thanks.
Yeah. To answer your question, Dini, I talked about the concepts of this bill with Laura, but this is the first time I'm looking at it in depth.
Okay.
I think Jen and Suzanne and David are also on this call.
Jennifer?
I'm just a little confused about the goals of what we're doing today. Can someone maybe verbalize what our goals are today to do? Because this is the student bill, and I'm not sure that I would be comfortable. I don't think we should be commenting on the student bill, but we were working towards a policy. Do we have a, so
Jennifer, so there was a very bare bones draft that went out. What we're doing with this, first of all, is that they actually want to partner with us on this. What this is, though, and this was what I was going to explain, is more of a procedures piece, right? So like we're looking at essentially draft procedures that the students were putting in place for particular things. We're using it as a reflection, essentially, to step back from the procedures that students in Brookline have identified as procedures that they want in place, to think backward about an effective policy that covers this. And then, of course, other things that there's a different, Janae, do you have the other document as well, or?
Sure. Let me find it. Sorry.
There are two that are essentially for idea generation only. We're not hijacking their document.
No, I made very clear to the student creators and the legislature advisor that this wasn't a co-opting or taking their work. And obviously Laura Cleaves is a member of the student member of school committee, that it was simply that our purposes today were to get eyes on it, to do exactly what you described, Val. The doc that you see right now was, again, the dates at the top, April 6, 2022 was the last iteration of this particular document. High school deans came together in partnership in some ways with legislature, the students who worked on that bill, to think about how adults were conceptualizing this, and they call it the social emergency plan. I can also, after I stop share this with people who are on this subcommittee, I would just say that, there's some good thinking in this doc as well. The challenge right now with this particular doc, so you see the immediate steps following an incident, and I'll keep scrolling. The challenges here are that the mechanisms are not yet in place to support the action steps that are outlined here. And similar, I believe, so I talked to Summer Williams on Friday, similar to what Jen Martin said of the student bill. They are also looking for a second set of eyes. Well, they've had several sets of eyes, but a little further vetting, and appreciate the insight as well.
So on that, I think, so first of all, this is great. Like, I would love to steal as much of this as possible, first of all. Okay. Second of all, just a conceptual question, Val, do you think a hate speech policy, I guess this is for both David and Val. Does hate speech or hate iconography policy belong within a Brookline equity policy, or do you think that's a separate policy that would accompany an equity policy? I mean, obviously there are linked topics.
Yeah, I mean, we had this discussion a bit when we were talking about our statement. And David, do you remember where we landed on the statement? Did we link those? Or did we say that we were going to put them together or separate?
I think we said we were going to put them separately and
Okay.
that we would try to fit hate speech possibly into some of the other existing policies rather than as a standalone, but we can certainly revisit that depending on how others feel.
I mean, I could see it either way. And if we had a separate policy, I would just say, for the purposes of this exercise, we should say within our equity policy that we're committed to having a safe environment for all students, and as such, we are committed to fulfilling the terms of a forthcoming or our existing our safety policies, including A, B, C, and D, including our policy about hate speech and or hate iconography. But if we do want to include it, then that's we could do that as well. I don't have a decision on that. I'll stop talking.
So Janae, I understand that in what they asked for, not everything is actionable, but we're likely to put a policy together that isn't going to be actionable on day one. We'll probably come somewhere in between all of, what was asked for in that bill and where we land. But I guess my question for you is, from where you stand, what elements do you see as critical in this policy for students from our perspective, for us to consider? There's lots in there on high school in particular, but I'm also thinking about, the pre-K to 8 situation as well.
Val, are you asking from a DI and J perspective or from an equity policy perspective?
From an equity policy perspective.
So I have to confess, I'm not sure. Andy's helped me understand a lot of the thinking that around what makes sense in policy, as we looked at the equity policy in policy subcommittee not too long ago, and some of what Jennifer was saying, what people were saying. I will tell you that I love the student thinking on the tiering and the sort of the clear outlining of the steps. Here's what happens the 4th step, the 5th step. I'm not sure that fits for a policy. Am I correct?
I would agree, because it seems that what the students have produced, it reads more to me like a set of procedures for how to handle different scenarios and situations, and less so an overarching policy statement. Certainly very helpful to know what students are thinking and what it is that we could incorporate into our policies, but I think it might be a little too detailed in terms of as a policy.
I agree. I mean, it's so instructive and useful for school leaders, for families, obviously parents and students to all be on the same page within the school buildings to understand. And the student bill, if you will, was all about something that could live in the handbook. So it's not necessarily district policy. There is good language, and I know that's what you were sort of thinking about, Val, with this. I'm sure there are lines or ideas that we could pull, but I agree.
No, it definitely is more of a procedure manual. I mean, I think that the rationale that they state is important, right? Like that, I think in many ways is something that we should look at more carefully.
Sorry,
and then
sorry,
I think it was in their first rationale for when they filed it. They have to write a rationale, right, for why they're filing the bill. But the other piece, and David, help me because I know that you've worked on some of these. I struggle a little bit in thinking about what goes in the equity policy versus other policies. So, David, I know you've worked on a lot of these in recent years. So, the gender discrimination piece, the sexual harassment, right? So we have a lot of student policies existing, and so there's a question for everybody on policy and for you, Janae, and for everybody else on this committee, on how this dovetails and how it doesn't, how, if it duplicates, how it duplicates, and if it doesn't, which gap are we filling?
So to me, at least, I was thinking of an equity policy more in line with what systems do we have in place or need to put into place to achieve equity? And that's both in terms of demography with staff, in terms of treatment of staff and students, in terms of curriculum to some degree, making sure that our students are exposed to diversity in an equitable manner, and a bit less so about discipline. I think that disciplinary issues can arise and be mentioned, but I think that anything that's more on the disciplinary side should fall into the bullying prevention policy or anti-discrimination policies.
I agree, but I guess the other question I'm asking is, we have a policy, right? And it's state law and it's federal law. They are not allowed to discriminate, on fill in the blank categories, right? So I guess maybe this is why I've struggled with Janae on getting a draft. I'm struggling to understand this section. Like, it was much easier for me to think about the staff section because there were actionable steps that we don't have in place and that are our professional development and things like that. That have corollaries on the student side.
Well, one area that would be parallel would be affinity groups, for instance. So that's something that our students already have. I'm not sure at every school, but at least some schools. As we recall at a recent school committee meeting, we heard from the Heath community about their affinity groups. So that could be one area. Another area could be in curriculum to ensure that we have diversity in our curriculum, that all groups are represented. Then conceptually, so something that was interesting to me that I saw in what the students have drafted for the high school handbook was this notion that if there is an act of discrimination against a marginalized group, that it should be publicized to the entire community.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if we want to take that element and put that in an equity policy. And if so, whether we want to put some additional boundaries around that, because I do worry that if something occurs in isolation, do we really want to perpetuate it by informing the whole community? So I do think there's a matter of degree to the offense. And I'm wondering what others' thoughts are on that.
I was just going to say, David, I was totally thinking the same thing, just considering Val's question about what might be pullable, is that communication to the community piece. It's still so drafty, but that felt like something from my understanding of what could live in policy. And everybody is shared on that document. I would share screen, but I think everybody has it now. So it's toward the bottom of the document.
So I guess on that one, my other concern, we can put something together and reflect on it at the next meeting, is privacy as well. Because I think that some of this can be identifiable in a way that could potentially harm more than help. So I don't know if Janae, if you thought about that or if that was getting addressed in the draft at all, but.
That's something as a dean we think about all the time. Yeah, I've had nothing to do with the creation of this document, but absolutely that's a point to consider.
Okay, so affinity groups, publicizing the community in a way that.
Are you able to see people who have their hands raised?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, now I do. Stephen and then Jennifer. Sorry if that's.
I think Jen had her hand raised first, so go ahead, Jen.
I just wanted to chime in about the communication piece, and I'm very concerned about privacy and for everyone involved. So I have a lot of thoughts about that. I'm not really sure that this is the time. But I want to make sure that we are thinking about that. I do think it's an issue. I think that I want to make sure that two things. I want to make sure that we're capturing what's happening at the high school, but also in our K-8s when we're thinking about the language of the policy, because it's a district policy. I am very hesitant for us to, or for myself, I guess I'll speak only for myself, to comment on anything that's like procedural within the district. I think it's helpful information and instructive and can help us in forming our policy, but procedures typically lie within the district. And I just do have some concerns about what exactly gets communicated to the public. Because I do think that some of these things can be very identifiable. And so I'm wondering what the right balance of information and awareness is important. But also, if we really want to create a safe space, it needs to be safe for our students. And I don't know how much people will want that attention drawn to them. Some may be more comfortable than others, and also making sure that we create a space for healing and growing. And I don't know. So there's just a lot of pieces to that. So I have not, because I didn't have the documents in advance, I need time to like read and process the two documents that were shared. And it's hard to do that for me in a live meeting, and that's fine. This is just an initial conversation. So I don't actually know the level of specificity in the student document. So I'm not even commenting on what that is. I'm just saying those are some concerns that I have, and I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm just worried about it.
Thank you. Stephen and then Lakia.
Thanks, Val. So Val, responding to your starting point, which I heard as you saying, and I totally get where you're coming from, that it was kind of natural how the faculty section, the teacher section of the equity policy would be fleshed out, because we would naturally talk about recruitment and retention. And it's less obvious how we map that onto the student section of an equity policy. And I want to respond by saying that I don't think it maps onto the student section, and that we have to create different subcategories for the equity policy for students, because I think there are different subtopics. And I want to propose 3 potential subtopics for the student section of the equity policy. I want to propose, and I'm doing this on my feet, so I'm very happy to have any of and all of them rejected. The first one would be something like a supportive and welcoming environment for students, and that would include things like affinity groups. The second would be a welcoming environment for students, and that would include something like policies against hate speech and hate iconography that promote student inclusion and belonging. So that's more around the environment rather than specific like mentorship or one-to-one or one-to-many supports. And then the third one would be equitable access to learning opportunities or achievement opportunities. And I think that has to do more with, I'm thinking about outputs. I'm thinking of lack of disproportionality as in advanced classes and MCAS scores and special education referrals and so on. I think that's also an element of an equity policy. But I think all 3 elements of that, a welcoming environment, a supportive environment, a welcoming environment, and an equitable access to learning opportunities, I think those seem to me likely subcategories of a student section of an equity policy.
Can you just say again the first one where you had?
Sorry, the first one is a supportive environment. The second one is a welcoming environment, and the third one is some kind of equitable access to learning opportunity or achievement opportunity. That's where I'm at right now. That's my rough thinking on this. I'm also
really like that, Stephen. The one slight modification or addition I might suggest is that the equitable access apply to school life in general. So certainly academic
Yeah.
opportunity and achievement opportunity, but also extracurriculars, electives, essentially anything that has to do with a student's school experience.
I agree. I mean, I think we've all gotten emails recently on students who are out of district, students who are METCO students, and others who have had some difficulty in accessing life outside of the regular school day. So I do think I like that addition, David, as well.
Can I just add, I would be really curious to hear Young and Saira's response to the student section of a policy, if there are any categories that jump out to them as well. Sorry, I know Lakia also has her hand raised.
Lakia?
I don't want to take you back a step because I think this is very valid information. I think the only thing I really wanted to point out when you were talking about communication is it's more about awareness than it is about communicating the actual act, but it's more about making, in some way, making it aware, because I think a lot of times these things aren't made aware. And so how do we put that into policy so that it is, and so that we can deal with it on a procedural level later? But I think it's more about awareness than it is about communicating the act or who was involved or what happened exactly. So
I agree with that.
So that's all I wanted to say about that. But you can go back to, because I find that what you were on was very valid. So go for it.
No, I think that's good, Lakia. I mean, it takes, right, it like sort of brings back and then lets the district think more about all the privacy pieces and come up with the procedure. Where we can create some policy around communicating certain acts of hate crime or bias, and to be communicated out to the within 24 hours, and then leave it to the district to procedure. So I mean, I don't know that takes away Jennifer's or my concern fully, but that would be the district, I think, who would need to sort of really work on where those guardrails are. But it's a really good point, Lakia. Jennifer, is your hand new, or is that?
Yes, it is. And I wanted to come back to I was looking back at the policy that we have right now, the short policy, I guess is how I'll refer to it. And actually, I think it was maybe Val who brought back one of the things that I wanted to come back to, and just thinking about all of the different, I don't know how to put this. Let's see. I'm just looking at it. We said age, ethnicity, gender identity, expression, learning differences, linguistic abilities, national origin, and the list continues: physical ability, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and just also have that really wide lens of like very, very many multifaceted, multi-layered pieces that are in there. And I want to just make sure that we keep all of that in mind. And you gave some examples, and I sort of wanted to highlight that learning differences piece. You talked about like out of district, I think, Val, and students coming from other parts of, outside of the community, perhaps, and coming into this community as part of this community, and thinking about that equitable access. And just wanted to really also highlight like that not only happens outside of the school day, but also inside when we think about electives and student access to electives and the number of electives that they can take based on their course load or like learning center. And there's just a lot of pieces to this. Like this policy is really big. And so I just was bringing myself back to it and just wanted to sort of draw attention. Sorry, that's it. And I really appreciate the comment about the communication and just in the awareness piece. And I just want to just be really thoughtful when we're doing that work, because when we bring awareness, that's really important. And then it gets kids maybe and families talking who are not aware of it to say like, okay, what happened at school today or what's going on? But then that can also, depending on the level of specificity that is shared, which of course we want to be mindful of, gets people asking questions. And I don't know, I just really want us to think about people's personal privacy as well, and what is that balance? I don't know what that perfect balance is, but looking to strive to find that balance.
Thank you, Jennifer. Stephen, you had asked if the students, I don't want, if you are interested in speaking up about what we've been talking about, or you think we're completely on the wrong track? Sarah, or do you?
Yeah, I think like on the right track here. Yeah, just adding on to what was just said, like I think from like the student perspective, it just creates like like more drama and miscommunication when there isn't transparency. So yes, it is important um that privacy is like, protected, but I think like it only creates more issues when it is not clear what happened and when.
Hi, sorry, I appreciate thinking about the privacy of students and the community members, and I also appreciate us thinking about not just the academic piece, but after school or the electives that were mentioned, and how some students have access to the different activities that are available after school, and even the affinity groups, and when they're being offered. So I appreciate all the different aspects that we're thinking about, that it's not just academic focused.
Great. Andy, Suzanne, others who haven't spoken?
I would just like to say that I really appreciate Lakia's explanation about what's intended by communication. For me, that's a distinction about that is more about awareness. That really helps me, at least, to understand what's intended. That it's more about understanding the issue and less about alleged perpetrator, victim, and identifying people. That can be very problematic. I do, though, want to, just from a different angle of this, at what point do we want to be, in a way, perpetuating a hate act that's taken place by disclosing it community-wide if it really was isolated? Because in a way, is that amplifying it? So I'm just curious what the thinking is there.
We've done a number of, we've had a number of conversations at the administrator level about degrees of offense, right? And sort of classifying, sort of categorizing bias incidents. That's sort of the thinking behind the social emergency plan, so that if, unfortunately, if a swastika shows up in a bathroom stall, if we're communicating that broadly every single time it happens, we do worry about copycat. We do worry about ways to sort of minimize an incident depending on how it happened, the ways the publicness of it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of thinking and some protocol work going on constantly to sort of look at those pieces, David, so that we're not amplifying something to, we had an event, as everybody knows, not too long ago, the chemical irritant, where, try to contain communication about that, so that it wasn't something that happened again and again. And yet, to Lakia's point, to Cyrus' point, it's really, really important to communicate when these things are happening, because not knowing causes all types of issues. So yes, it could go into more detail on what some of that looks like, but yeah, we're working with school leaders to be really, really thoughtful and intentional, to use some of Jennifer's language around how and when and what we communicate.
So Janae, I have a question not related exactly to this policy. I believe it's under our general anti-discrimination policy that there's a report that's required to be produced annually to the policy committee or to the full school committee. I'm not remembering exactly, on incidents, number of incidents, type of incident. Am I misremembering this, David? I'm looking at you.
That's correct. And
I think so.
committee.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm asking is, would all of those swastikas, even if they aren't communicated out, would they all be accounted for in a report? Would we know that there had been 24 instances at BHS and 45 in the school year at all the K-8s, for example?
Yeah, I mean, my hope would be that the answer to that question is yes. I don't know that there is, or I haven't been in the room around like stern sort of messaging to principals to make sure every single time this has happened, make sure you account for everyone for that report. but I trust our school leaders that that is accurate.
I think that'd be a very good idea to include in a policy so that we can have a snapshot at the end of the year about which types of acts of discrimination took place, rather than necessarily communicating every single individual incident. Because what I'm thinking about with the wording that we saw earlier, if one student uses an epithet to another student, I'm not condoning that in the least, absolutely not, it's horrendous. But if we're realistic about it, that probably happens every day. And if we're going to be sending emails about that to the whole community every single day, it'll have the impact, I think, of desensitizing the community. Oh, somebody was called a blank today, if there are tons of those, but still to have some idea, at least in a report at the end of the year, about how often and in which category, that can help perhaps lead to more organized, meaningful responses.
Mhm.
I agree with that, David, but do you think that that's beyond what's in our current policy? So is that new? Are we going to be adding, I guess, are you looking for new additions, right? So like socioeconomic status, for example, isn't included, I don't think, in our anti-discrimination policy. And perhaps it's not included in some of the in-school and after-school activities that we were just talking about. So are you thinking about expanding it? So are you thinking about 2 reports, I guess, or are you thinking about one that supersedes the current one that we have?
I'm open to what others think on that. Because on the one hand, I wouldn't want to duplicate something that's already taking place, but as you just pointed out, there are certain categories that are not covered under the existing reporting requirements.
Help me with any hands up. Jennifer.
Yes, I just wanted to say that at the end of our Brookline equity policy that we currently have, it says at least once per academic year, the superintendent or designees shall present an update to the school committee on the district's progress with equity initiatives. But it doesn't specify like reporting incidents in there, unless that's going to fall under an umbrella of equity initiatives. And I know that some of the other, we'd have to go back and look, David. Do you remember exactly which policies have reporting requirements in them?
I think it lives in the anti-discrimination policy, the broad anti-discrimination policy.
I don't know if it's also in bullying. I would need to go back and look at the language to go and see. So I don't know if we want to, I don't know, create a structure within this policy, or if it's covered in other, I don't know. We'd have to go back and look at the exact language. It's a good question. We can, and I don't know. As long as it's covered somewhere, I mean, I think a lot of this could be done in one report out to the school committee and sort of like covering lots of policies. I don't know. I would leave that up to the superintendent, but I'm not sure where it would fit.
Okay, I'll work with David to look at some of the other policies to see what we have reporting. Andy.
Well, pretty much the same. Just this conversation is making me wonder for at least the second heading that Stephen was proposing, like, creating a welcoming environment and combating hate speech and so forth. I mean, would it make more sense just to tweak existing policies rather than have it be a section of an altogether new policy?
To me, at least, I think that given that we want to at least have a staff equity policy, it would make sense to have equity covered for the other groups that are in our school system, which obviously would include students.
But that student section could be about the other headings, and then when it comes to actual acts of discrimination, then those are addressed rightly in a discrimination policy.
Oh, I see your point. Okay.
Right. I'm not suggesting we not have a student section, but that the second subheading in particular that Stephen was proposing could actually be better addressed by revising existing policies.
Andy, which section were you referring to that of the list that Stephen had?
I think the way Stephen was putting it was that this is the part on like creating a welcoming environment or ensuring a welcoming environment and sort of combating hate speech, I think he mentioned.
Are those
Just over like combating overt acts of discrimination and hate.
So Andy, so you're talking about the discrimination policy, right?
I think it would naturally live there, yes.
Right. So I don't think an anti-hate speech policy is the same as a discrimination policy. I think this is something that that came up in the care group that Janae is leading. Also, a discussion of, and this is also getting back to something that Jen said. To me, it's not laying out as a process, step by step, what happens in the event of an incident, so much as what are the elements of PSB's response in the event of an incident, i.e., the district commits to robust communications with the following groups. It commits within a certain time period. It commits to the following principles, and so on. And I think that's not quite the same as an anti-discrimination policy, which I think just sort of states the principles of being against discrimination in the schools.
Well, I believe ours goes a lot further. I mean, there's a lot of work done on this last year, and it actually gets pretty specific. So.
Okay, then maybe I just need to refamiliarize myself with it.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I do think that both the anti-discrimination and bullying policy, although they may cover sort of different areas, are pretty detailed. And I actually wanted to go back to the idea of the welcoming environment and make sure that when we're thinking about the language that we bring it back to that sort of our first paragraph and our list of like all of the different ways that we think about creating a welcoming environment and all of the, I don't know, how we can reach all of the human beings in front of us and make a welcoming environment that we're covering. I know, thinking about how we can do that. I'm not sure what language we're going to use in a policy, but there's so many lenses, so many varied lenses to think about this work in. I guess my question is, what is our next step?
So I can take a crack at a draft with Janae. But before that, I had a question on the welcoming piece.
Wait, I'm sorry. Before you go into that question, Val, I would like to return to the previous point for just a moment. So I did review the discrimination policy, and it does. I see the work that was put into it, but it is a list of what constitutes harassment, rather than what does the district commit to in the event of harassment, which I think is different than an anti-hate speech policy. What I'm suggesting is that an anti-hate speech policy outline the elements of a framework for what the district will do in the event of an event or incident relating to hate speech or hate iconography, rather than define what constitutes harassment and then restate our commitment to opposing harassment, which seems to be more the thrust of the policy against discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, and retaliation, which I believe is what you're referring to. So I think it is different, and I do think it could belong under an equity policy under the student section.
Or as a standalone. I mean, I guess.
Or as a standalone, yeah. But I don't think it's currently covered by the discrimination policy.
Jennifer?
So, Stephen, are you talking about a set of procedures for what the district will do in the event of hate speech? Because that doesn't typically.
No.
So can you clarify what, are you proposing that we create another policy? And then secondly, can you just clarify.
I am proposing that we either create a policy, which I think would be outside the scope of this particular discussion, or a section of this current policy, which could be within the scope of this current discussion, in which case it would fit under the student section of an equity policy. That is a kind of framework for how the district could respond in the event of hate speech incidents within our schools. That would be short of a process, which I think is the kind of policy that we saw in the document that Janae shared, which is very step-by-step. Here are the criteria for degrees of magnitude of different kinds of incidents. But when I say a framework, I mean the district commits to communications with parents within a short period of time of the event, communications with the entire school community within a period of time of the event, reaffirmation of some of the key principles of anti-hate speech, like reference to school policy, reference to anti-bullying and discrimination policy. Just what are the elements of how we respond to hate speech, and noting that it's separate from discrimination policy, that we regard it as an event that needs to be responded to specifically, and that we have a set of ideas, principles, or just general elements of a response. And the reason that I'm putting this forward, I feel like I'm saying this too abstractly. The reason I'm putting this forward is that I feel like I heard from a lot of, and Jennifer, what we can't do as well, because I feel like what I heard from a lot of community members is frustration that they didn't understand what was supposed to happen after an incident, that they didn't know what the consequences were, or what the school did or did not do. So this is also an opportunity for us to say that state or national law constrains us from revealing what exactly the disciplinary consequences were for a student. So to fully articulate these kinds of matters as well, so that it represents a kind of guideline for communities and parents to see what exactly is PSB doing in the aftermath of a hate event. Because I think there's a lot of confusion, disappointment, fear, anger that doesn't really go away, that just lingers and builds until the next one, and then it accumulates over time. So that's to me the purpose of an anti-hate speech, anti-hate iconography policy. Do you think I'll stop there?
Yeah, I was gonna say that to me sounds more like procedure, or where you went with the sort of the bulk of it sounds more like procedure to me than policy. And I guess I have a question for folks, because we've talked about, at this moment, Stephen, I'm just thinking about iconography, for instance, right? So if Janae is saying that as a practical matter, not every swastika in the bathroom is going to be acted upon, or, name a different symbol, right? So I'm just trying to think then about a policy that's flexible enough, but clear enough on what we want the district to do with, do we want them to what on the anti-iconography, I guess is my question to folks.
I see.
Do you know what I mean? Like, so is it that we're asking them to put procedures in place to what? That's a question for everybody on the floor. I'm trying to work through that question after hearing Janae.
I would,
and then what you just said, Stephen.
To me, it's an opportunity to articulate the principles that govern our response. So it would say something like PSB sees this as an opportunity to, one, communicate with the community around the schools, in as much as it's possible for us to do so. Two, to ensure as much as we can that this is a safe space. So it's a safe and welcoming space for all students. So to communicate with students as best as possible, whether that means, and that could be on a school by school basis, but also three, to recognize that students are still forming, and to to look to take a rehabilitative and educational posture towards the perpetrator, and as much as possible, just to articulate whatever the principles we feel ought to govern the event in a policy, and have that be standard across the schools. So that to me seems less process oriented and more an elaboration of the elements of what we need to be thinking about in that case, and also something for school communities to reference after an event, so they'll know, okay, the school's going to communicate out about that. There's a possibility they might have an assembly, or etc. I recognize what you're saying, like it can't be too specific because otherwise it's not policy, we're meddling. But it has to have some substance, or else it's meaningless.
Jennifer and then Andy.
I think that it sounds a lot, that sounds like procedures to me, saying that there would be an assembly or dictating that there would be a communication or something specific within an amount of time sounds like procedures to me. I do think it's important to clarify for the community about what we can and cannot share, like we as in the district, right? What the district can and cannot share. But typically, and I'm just thinking about prior communications that have gone out to the community. It might be helpful to add that in the communication so that there is not an expectation that information that cannot be shared would be shared in the future. And I think it would be helpful in those communications from the district to the community to outline what the steps are and the plans. But a lot of the ideas that we're discussing are procedural pieces. I'm feeling like, although I could be convinced otherwise, that we should go back and look and see in our existing policies or within this policy what's missing that we feel belongs in a policy, and that's not meeting the needs of what we want to communicate. But a lot of this sounds like procedures for me.
Andy and then David.
Yeah, I'm feeling like we've reached the end of like any abstract discussion of what is policy versus what is procedure. Like someone just needs to take a stab at drafting it, and then so that we have something to react to and see whether like it does look like we can or cannot come up with something that sounds like a policy. I would just request that it not be thought of as necessarily sitting within a student section, because I think you don't have to be a student to either be the target of or engage in hate speech. So, it should sit somewhere outside both the staff and the student sections of this policy.
Thank you, Andy. David and then Janae.
I was just going to say that to Stephen's point about desiring something that's actionable in a policy, but to Jennifer's point, not going too far that it sounds like a procedure. I think one potential option could be to track incidents sort of as a parallel that we do with the anti-discrimination policy. And then as a part of a report that comes back to us, state that we would like the district to track any patterns that emerge in the types of hate iconography, in the types of incidents that occur, and then report back to the school committee on what patterns they noticed, as well as what a plan of action will be to address it. So for example, swastikas came up. If it turns out that 85% of incidents with hate iconography were swastikas, then that would probably inform the district that more needs to be done in terms of anti-Semitic training, and that would then become an actionable item. So I think there might be a way to have it in between, where we have the districts look at patterns that emerge from the data and then come up with an action plan in response to the pattern.
Janae and then Suzanne.
Sorry, I can be brief. I just loved your thinking through all that, Stephen, and just wanted to agree with Andy about the point that maybe it does not best live in the student section. I love the idea of the framework language that you use, thinking about it not necessarily being prescriptive, but literally the principles behind what we're trying to do. So I love the suggestion to just get going, writing it and seeing what happens, and putting it somewhere that's not just in the student section.
Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this thoughtful discussion for everyone. I think part of the issue is, in terms of communicating with the public, is that we've lost trust somewhere along the line, that they will trust that our administrators, our deans, everything, will do the right thing. And I'm not saying they're not doing the right thing. I think they just don't know about it. And so, again, in a policy, I don't think we would outline steps and procedures, but I do think it would be helpful if the public community knew what those are, not as a policy, but as a procedure coming from our administrators, so that there is a sense that when things happen, they are taken care of. I mean, that the community doesn't need to know everything that has gone on. That never happens in a school, because things happen all the time, and administrators take care of it. And but the community wants to know that is happening, and that there is some sense of that. So, what David suggested, if trends or patterns are reported to us in, some kind of numbers or data, and, what that looks like, and what is it that the district needs to do to attend to those trends and patterns, I think that would be helpful. But the individual actions and specifics, again, happens at the school level with the administrator. The district support is there, but it's not coming from the school committee, is my thinking about that.
Thank you, Suzanne. Anyone else? Before I endeavor with Janae to put 1, 2, or maybe 2 and an amendment to another policy together.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to Stephen's proposed structure for the student section. I really like it, and I understand that there is going to be that issue about where the discrimination part should lie, and if we should have that second category that Stephen articulated about a welcoming environment. I do see a distinction between a welcoming environment and not being discriminated against. Not being discriminated against is an absolute minimum. Of course, we don't want to tolerate discrimination, but that's not the same as cultivating an environment that's welcoming. So I do think that there could be some material that goes into that category that's separate from discrimination.
Yeah, I was actually just now, David, conceiving of it sort of collapsing welcoming and supporting, or welcoming and supportive. If we're thinking about moving hate speech to a separate policy, the welcoming and supporting environment being the first section, and thinking about things like, what we just talked about. So affinity groups and, and other programs. In that vein, I'm wondering what people think about requiring K-8s to have certain affinity groups. Andy?
Oh, well, I wasn't prepared to address that, so I had my hand
Okay.
up for something else, so I'll wait.
Okay. Oh, no, go ahead. I mean, unless folks have initial thoughts on requiring affinity groups and how many that would be. I mean, Janae, do you know how many are it would be in terms of stipends, and what it would mean in terms of educator time and budget and things like that?
I mean, we have GSAs by law in all of the schools. We have young scholars and a lot. Sorry, I'm trying to do the math in my head. We certainly have several affinity group spaces in our K-12 schools. I would say quite a few at the high school, and then 3 to 4 to 5 potentially, depending on how you want to define affinity, in the K-8s.
Thanks. Jennifer?
I was just wondering about the word requirement. I'm not sure, I don't know, and Janae could speak to this much better than I could, or maybe other staff members what our capacity is. So to require that and then run them all. And then my other question was, so one is, I guess, a question around our capacity to actually require it right now, whether or not we can do that ourselves. And what that would entail to achieve that goal. And then the second part of that is like, how are we going to define or name what affinity groups that encompasses? Is that there's so many levels to that. And so I'm just, it makes me wonder. Like, I started thinking about when we talked about trends and we talked about like communicating, like how does the district decide at what point to communicate? I know people are talking about this all the time and wondering about this and thinking about that. And then, you know, because we do have a sexual harassment policy, but what I guess I was starting to think, what do we mean by hate speech? It's just a really big conversation. It's a really big conversation, way beyond what we have right now. But I'm just wondering about the requirement to do that. We would need, in order to say require, I think we would need to define a whole number of other things, which I don't think we're quite ready to do at this moment. But like, as we continue to develop things, thinking about what are we requiring exactly? Because if we put it in as a requirement, then we need to make sure that we are setting a path towards being able to do that work. So we're setting ourselves, you know, that we should set a goal that we may not be able to do right now. That doesn't mean we shouldn't set the goal just because we can't do it. But if we're going to make a requirement, like what exactly are we requiring?
David and Sarah, and then back to Andy.
I'm a bit uncomfortable with the requirement language for a different reason. So beyond capacity, just philosophically, I'm not sure that we want to force students to go into affinity groups if they don't want to. We want to make it available. So
I wasn't talking about forcing students to go. I was talking about requiring K-8s to have them.
Right. No, I'm not trying to suggest that you would force students to do it. But I guess what I mean more is that to require something indicates that it exists. And if there is not the support, the natural support for it in a particular school community, I'm not sure what the point would be in creating what would then be an empty shell. So I think making something available if there is demand for it, but I'm not sure that we would need to make it an absolute requirement.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I would want to, maybe we can invite ASA and some of our other school leaders. I mean, I think that not all of our schools are created equal. And so I don't know that the demographics at Heath are so markedly different from our other K-8s, yet they are the gold standard for K-8 affinity spaces. So, you know, I guess I can take these my questions offline about how it is that Heath was able in a pretty natural way to open up those conversations and, you know, have an AAPI, for instance, affinity space that I don't know that any of our other K-8s have.
Baker does.
Baker does. So I guess, David, just like my only comment is that I think there's also a school culture piece that, you know, like in terms of like priority of the school leader or school leaders that may be different in some of the K-8s, and which is why I was thinking of it in a policy sense. But need not. Sarah.
Just to kind of respond to that, I know at the high school, most of the affinity groups are started and run by students. So I think like the point of requiring them would be that in the K-8 schools, students aren't starting these groups. So just to have them accessible, like I know a lot of students would benefit from having them available, and especially since like they aren't in the position to be starting them themselves.
Lakia?
I guess I would love for them to be there, but I think there are some equity issues that would need to be dealt with even before that. And I think you touched upon it a little bit when you talked about like how Keith School is able to do it versus other schools not necessarily having that capacity. So I like the idea, but maybe if it was something that was more district-wide versus each school to school base, you might be able to have that more fair across the district. But that's just me throwing something out there that is probably outside of the scope here. But I just feel like I don't think it can be a requirement, so I agree with that, but I feel like it needs to be more than just waiting for a leader to come up with it. And I also know that each school has its own needs, so I'm just throwing that out there.
It's a really good point. Thank you, Lakia. Kevin, and then Janae.
Yeah, I agree with Lakia because it's difficult to have it like across every school without marginalizing certain groups by having some groups in one school and not some in the other. But Sarah also talked about the importance of them, and I feel like there are definitely like very like small minorities in each of the schools that deserve to have their own affinity group. So I think like as an idea, it would help a lot of students, and so finding a way to do it, I think, would be paramount.
Thanks, Kevin. Janae?
Hi, Kevin. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining. Just wanted to add, there is work that's happening. One of the great benefits to having the assistant director position in Haeyoung is that she's working on AAPI affinity, getting that up and going at FRR and at Lincoln School and across the district, and models similar to what we have for GSAs. Jennifer's point about capacity is an important one, especially when we think about racial affinity at times, because we are working hard to get educators of color to come to our district and stay in our district, and then to also to say to them, now you also need to run this affinity group, which plenty of them actually want to do, but shouldn't be expected to do. And so we certainly have, for example, that affinity group, the AAPI one at Heath, there's a person who doesn't identify as AAPI who's doing a lot of the work in running that group along with Haeyoung. And so we also look for educators who have worked with certain populations and can do that. So, but again, capacity can be a challenge for us. I do believe that our school leaders care very much about affinity, and it's not an excuse, but honestly, coming out of the pandemic and contract and so many different things happening, sometimes it's hard to get folks to help sign on for that work, but there's a full court press around getting that to happen currently.
Janae, do you know how many of our GSAs are actually run by members of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, just about.
It's not that many, right?
No, several of them are co-run, and so there's so yes, in most cases, and so we also have our LGBTQ task force, and a number of those folks who run the GSAs and the K-8s come to those meetings along with parents and students, and I would say, look to run through my brain, but I'm pretty confident all of them are in fact, not all of them, but most of them are in fact run by people who identify in the community.
Okay, Driscoll must be the outlier then. Which is my frame of reference. Andy, did you?
Yeah, just on affinity groups, I just remind people that there is already language on that in the staff section, which I think could probably work in the student section as well. The only difference being that these are for students rather than staff. So it just says that PSB will take active measures to create and support these groups, but it doesn't specify that every school has to have a group of every kind. So.
Good reminder. Thanks, Andy. David?
I really liked Lakia's point about the equity issue with affinity groups between schools, and that schools have different capacities. I'm wondering to what extent K-8 affinity groups could be somewhat centralized district-wide in the sense of distribution of materials and just providing information that these affinity groups exist. If you would like an affinity group at your school and one doesn't already exist, here are steps you could take. Do we have that type of coordination in place already? It sounds like with a GSA there might be, but I'm not sure about these other affinity groups.
We do. Just last year, we worked on getting sort of a Google group to exist to link all of the GSA advisors or leaders all on a shared Google forum so that they could post about their activities, and students, they could share information. So that got off and running last spring. In terms of young scholars, we're working with the MECO director, Malcolm Cawthorn, to kind of think about pulling all of those advisors together to have conversations about curriculum and things like that. So that's in process. I think there are those mechanisms that exist. I think, to Kevin's point, you know, you have groups at the high school, for example, and Cyrus' point, there are so many of them. I don't know that we're going to make Google groups, or obviously for all of those groups, but I think there are ways we can work on some of that shared sort of information among affinity spaces. The adults are kicking theirs off in January, and I think a lot of that's going to trickle down as well to the student communities.
Are there any schools that have, so not parent, but students with disabilities groups, a support group, a group that meets in the K-8s?
Not that I know of in the K-8s. I don't have that information, no.
Like, that's one where I think we would need to support, right, in a different way than perhaps, but I think one where, particularly as students approach middle school, the same age that we start the GSAs and things at, in the K-8s, seems like something to think about.
Yeah,
Again, for students who want to self-select, right, and who want to talk to other students who share some of that.
Right, we're in conversation to have a group for adult educators with that identity, and our hope is and that's a district-wide thing. Our hope is that folks in that group can sort of feel empowered to sort of take some of what we're doing as adults to and think about student work.
Somebody else, Kevin, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, no, just to Mr. Perlman's point, I was going to say that, like Sarah said, there's a lot of affinity groups that are led by students in the high school, and I'm sure that a lot of them would love to go to the middle schools and the K through 8s just to help out. I don't know if that would like alleviate some of these issues.
That's a really great point. It certainly helps with the Young Scholars Program in terms of like the homework help piece. They're fabulous. It's a good point, and thank you, Kevin, for raising it. I don't know that it obviates the need for an educator, but it's a good resource to think about as well for our younger students. Anybody else before I go on this drafting mission and ask for Janae's help?
Speed, Val.
Thanks, Stephen. Any new or other business? Anybody want to move to adjourn?
I so move.
Second on that, anyone?
I'll second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? No? All right. Well, thank you all. And we'll get minutes out, and I will get working on a draft so people can reflect on the draft.
Thank
Thanks
you,
so
Kevin
much.
and Syra. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.